these economic reforms and political reforms and accountability kind of reforms that all kind of moved countries in the same direction and imposed that kind of political will that's clearly missing in a lot of other regions. Other regions don't have that kind of carrot to keep countries on track. But the point is, when you did have that carrot and all those reforms did get pursued, there was a way in which you saw movement along the same trajectories that seemed to be pretty mutually reinforcing. I mean, it doesn't really show the case necessarily of, what that reducing corruption and promoting democracy are necessarily going to be mutually reinforcing, but they can be. I guess it's more, trying to ask less of that case, or less of the case of EU accession. And so then the final question about, let's see, illegal activities and the criminality of the state versus sporadic corruption. Yeah, that also gets at the point that you have very different kinds of corruption. I talked about administrative corruption or petty corruption versus political or grand corruption. You can talk about sort of predatory, kleptocratic state. That you can talk about a lot of post-conflict countries. You have the state that's very much embedded in these corrupt networks, the holdovers from conflict. There are all different kinds of corruption profiles that are out there, and the syndromes that I put on the slide, one of those slides they're borrowing from Michael Johnson's work, get at that to some extent. There's certainly more that could be brought to bear in terms of analyzing different kinds of corruption, but I thought I couldn't do that justice probably.
What can be done, right? What's the policy? Is there any policy relevant advice to take away from this? There is. If we broaden our frame of reference from the usual focus on administrative and fiscal aspects of decentralization with some light references to the political motivations for the whole thing in the first place, what are some policy implications? Well, maybe we would recognize things that we wouldn't be in a hurry to change. It seems common in other settings, non-Indonesian settings, for regional political parties to exist, and many people think, some Indonesians included, that was a key part of the peace settlement in Aceh, that introducing local parties will enable local people to inject their interests into the political system more readily than they can if they're constrained by the existence of strong national parties. Well, what if the thing that made decentralization work for Indonesia as a whole is the balance that has been struck between, on the one hand, radical administrative, political, and fiscal decentralization, and on the other hand, the enforcement of centralized political parties. What if it's that balance, in other words, between political centralization at the legislative and political and decentralization and power to the regions? If that's the glue that kept it together, maybe the advice that Indonesia get with the program and have local political parties, because that will facilitate local voice, may not be a very good thing to do. The other implication is that when we observe problems at the local level, just because we see them in a district that is newly empowered, or in a provincial capital that is newly but differently empowered, we should not attribute those shortcomings to decentralization per se. They quite likely reflect just as much, or if not more, shortcomings in democratization. And so the solution for a donor, for someone from the outside who wants to assist them, and certainly you may have to cast this in terms of decentralization, because that's the program that you can support. But it should be an explicit recognition that it's not decentralization per se, that's the cause that needs to be addressed. The other is a more realistic understanding of what's happening frequently, and I read this in donor reports, whatnot. There's a real problem of vertical coordination. Those folks out in the provinces and the districts don't think they have to follow central direction. Well, no kidding. They had to do that for 30 or 40 or 50 years, and they don't want to now. This isn't so much a question of, can we find the right law or regulation so that everybody will coordinate happily? This is a political struggle. various competing groups, just as in other settings there have been classes that have been in conflict. I mean, these are political struggles over the shape of the state. We should, if we accept them for that, rather than perceive them as sort of failures on the part of the drafters of the legislation. They didn't realize that they needed to specify more carefully the rights and responsibilities of local governments vis-a-vis national governments. I think that would be a more realistic assessment of the problem. And finally, just looking back to over the last 15, 20 years of donor support for decentralization in Indonesia, or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but especially in Indonesia. Most of that period, Indonesia was centralized and authoritarian, but the assistance that donors provided was very, very important, I think, in enabling the transition to decentralization to proceed relatively smoothly, given the scale of the change that occurred. How so? At the time that the transition was occurring in 1997, 98, and 99, the people who were charged with drafting or presented with the opportunity to draft new legislation, they already knew what they wanted to do. Their counterparts with whom they coordinated very poorly over the Ministry of Finance, who drafted a lot of intergovernmental fiscal regulations, already knew what they wanted to do. How did they already know what they wanted to do? SARC would only step down a matter of months before. They knew because they had interacted over at least 10 years with foreign donors who were constantly discussing this. And you can see in all of the reports that were written in 96 and 97, enormous frustration that Suharto would not permit political decentralization, and that there was an unrealistic expectation that these things would actually be implemented. But it was an educational process that meant there were large numbers of people who accepted that centralization was a problem, decentralization was a solution, and they already had sketched out not only those things that they knew were acceptable to the government, but those things that they knew were unacceptable, but at some future time might be possible. And any of the people who took advantage of that opportunity speak about it in the same terms and say, we had a window of opportunity. We knew the parties were weak. We knew they couldn't foresee the implications of these changes. And we took advantage of that because we knew that on principle that it was a good thing. So there's a role, I think, for donors to play, which is educational.
Yeah, I want to say that looking at it from the side of what can be done by the donors, I think the first thing we have to look at is that, albeit of its problems, we've got a reform underway. And the first task, I think, is to consolidate and strengthen the reform in its various dimensions. I mean, strengthen the regional, the political structure and representativeness of the local and regional governments, to strengthen the process of devolution, strengthen particularly the process of the tax transfers, the fiscal reform, which is also a big problem, and also to continue the operation of the participatory budget with all its problems. What I'm trying to say is that if we've got the law, no matter how problematic it is, no matter how limited it is, it has opened a process. So first of all, we have to struggle to accomplish the law because there are still lots of leaks in the whole process. But in the second sense, I think we have to stimulate. The role of donors is at the same time as trying to make the law be accomplished, is stimulate regional and local practices, innovative practices that in fact are being generated by consensus between local regional authorities and the civil society organizations to improve the situations, particularly in participatory budget. No? And I think the stimulus of that is a very important thing, because it's not only the source of a communication and legitimacy of regional and local governments, but most of all is the basic source, I think, for initiatives legal initiatives that can be changed at the national level. And among them, not only the ones I mentioned that have been changed already by several regional governments, but most of all, the idea that the decentralization in a so heterogeneous country has to have heterogeneous institutions too. This has to be understood, and that means one of the greatest challenges in decentralization to the central government, as centralized as has historically been in Peru. And I think the role of donors in this aspect can be very crucial. The relationship between donors and NGOs and state agencies has to coincide in these objectives, no? And that will allow us to pass this critical point of having ensured that decentralization is not going to come back. And we're currently facing in Peru that risk, no?
Thanks, Lucho. Thanks, Phyllis, Mike, and Luis. Let me just make a couple of housekeeping notes before you take off. We're going to break for lunch now, and if you're going to stay around for our keynote speech at 2 o'clock, a presentation by Philippe Schmitter, there's a food court. There's a food court downstairs, way downstairs, but there's plenty to eat down there. I've been asked, and I would encourage you not to go up to the 6th floor cafeteria at the Woodrow Wilson Center. The demand is just too great that they can't accommodate everybody. So please, if you need some lunch and are going to come back, go down to the ground floor. Second, there will be a lunch for the panelists on the 4th floor. So if you're a presenter for the conference, please go to the 4th floor. Second, this whole event will be uploaded it's being videotaped, will be uploaded online in, I think he said a week or two. 2 weeks? About a couple of weeks. So this will be accessible online, which will be very nice. Hopefully other people will have access to it. And finally, I'd just like to wish you would join me in warmly thanking our panelists for their excellent presentations. Thank you. See you at 2 o'clock.
I'm trying to find a way to sit next to it's just so being pillar and can't get too far this way, that way. I was in Singapore last week when they had earthquakes and everything, and it was funny because I was in Singapore, which is right nearby, and apparently at 8. I didn't feel it at all. The next morning.
Begin our afternoon session with the keynote address by Philippe Schmitter. I'm Sam Wells, the Associate Director at the Wilson Center. I'm pleased to have the honor to introduce Professor Schmitter. I was reminding him that we met more years ago than either of us would like to acknowledge when the project on the transition from authoritarianism was in its early days. That will give some of you who are sufficiently long in the tooth a chance to do the calculations. Philippe Schmitter is one of the most distinguished comparativists working in political science today, and we're very privileged to have him here. He also, among academics, has another distinction, which is unusual for those people we introduce at the Wilson Center. He's a native Washingtonian. He went to much of his secondary schooling here, attended Dartmouth, was a graduate student at the Graduate Institute of International Studies at Geneva, and completed his doctorate in comparative politics at Berkeley. He has worked in teaching assignments at the University of Chicago, at the European University Institute, at Stanford, and then back to Florence to the European University Institute, where he was a professor and since 2005 a professorial fellow, which I assume means that he has the best of all deals, very few students, if any, and
Nobody knows what professorial fellow means.
Okay.
It means all high, but
Good.
I get
that
enough.
sounds like a good deal. But He has published extensively books and articles on comparative politics, regional integration in Western Europe and Latin America, on the transition from authoritarian rule in Southern Europe and Latin America, and on the intermediation of class, sectoral, and professional interests. His current work is on the political characteristics of the emerging Euro polity, on the consolidation of democracy in Southern and Eastern Europe, and on the possibility of a post-liberal democracy in Western Europe and North America. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to the Center Professor Schmitter.
Thank you very much, and I thank those of you who have made it possible for me to come here. I apologize, I have not had enough time to put together a shorter talk, and so I'm going to try to condense things as I go along, but as is often the case, it's easier to talk longer than it is to talk shorter. The title I've given it is Defects and Deficits in the Quality of Neo-Democracy, Latin America and Beyond. Now, the quality of democracy has become the flavor of the year, or perhaps of the decade, among students of democratization. And these students seem to be competing among themselves to find the most negative and the most diminutive adjective or qualifier they can to place in front of the word democracy in order to undervalue the accomplishments of these neo-democracies, i.e. those that have emerged after roughly 1974. And this is especially the case among Latin Americanists. So we are told, or led to believe, that neo-democracies are flawed, facades, pseudo, partial, semi, ersatz, stalled, low intensity, and I gather here in Washington, D.C., the favorite one, or one of the favorites, is illiberal, or derogative, defective, or deficitary. Now, I have to confess that Guillermo O'Donnell and I, in the book that he was in, the little green book that finally came out of this effort of the Wilson Center, sort of may have anticipated this context by coming up with the contrast between so-called dictablandas and democraduras. So we already, in some sense, anticipated this game of trying to identify, although we didn't think of it as an adjective, but as a substantive. Now, I think I know why this fashion has emerged. Quite unexpectedly, the countries that have democratized since 1974 have been successful in installing and even in sustaining the basic institutions of so-called formal or electoral democracy. Quite contrary, of course, to the previous experience with Latin America, where when we started this project in the Wilson Center, I did a primitive calculation that of every 3 attempts to democratize in Latin America, 2 failed. This time, however, none have failed, at least not overtly, and have reverted, therefore, to autocracy. We've seen some backsliding, etc., but we have not seen the emergence of overtly dictatorial or autocratic regimes. These countries all have impeccably democratic constitutions in terms of their proclaimed rights and purposes and institutions. They even have an impressive formal array of constitutional courts, ombudsmen, electoral commissions, general auditing authorities, specialized human rights monitors, and some even have corruption agencies. All the formal bells and whistles, not just of vertical accountability in the classic democratic sense, but also of this newly discovered horizontal accountability. Now, in formal terms, therefore, the neo-democracies, I'm thinking now of the ones in Latin America, certainly those in Southern Europe, and so far the ones at least in Central and Eastern Europe, all deserve the status which I call REDs, R-E-D, meaning real existing democracies. Polyarchies, if we want to use the term of Robert Dahl, with, however, the serious limits that this implies, i.e. government by representatives elected by vast publics in territorial constituencies under pre-established constitutional and legal constraints within a predictable and narrow range of uncertainty concerning who will win and what they will do once they are in office. In short, they respect the two hidden rules of real existing democracy, namely contingent consent, that is to say, you can afford to lose with the expectation that you will be allowed sufficient resources and sufficient opportunity to get back into power, and bounded uncertainty. In other words, you have reasonable, if you lose, you have reasonable expectations that whoever it is takes power will not do uncertain things or a certain range of uncertain things which will deprive you of your resources in the future. That's the kind of hidden formula, so to speak, that lies behind all real existing democracies. Some have even settled into such predictable patterns of mass and elite behavior that they are as boring to themselves and to outside observers as their archaeo-democratic predecessors in Western Europe. Much was once asked very early on in its democracy, but how would I know when a democracy was consolidated? And I said, it's simple. As soon as your politics become boring, your democracy is consolidated. As soon as you can predict reasonably well who's going to win and what kinds of subjects are going to be and what the agenda is going to be, your democracy is probably consolidated. Now, this state of affairs has been profoundly unsettling to most students of democratization, especially those such as myself, who went through the exciting days of regime changes under conditions of high uncertainty and even higher expectations about what this change in regime would produce. I remind those in the audience who do not know it that I got dragged into this business of democratization by way of Portugal, and Portugal, in retrospect, was the most uncertain and tumultuous of all of the changes from autocracy to democracy. Not only do we feel disenchanted with the results, but so do many, if not most, of the citizens in these neo-democracies, if one is to judge by the admittedly primitive questions that are posed to them by instruments such as Latino Barometro, Afro Barometro, and other specialized mass surveys, comparative surveys in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and in Asia. The dirty secret, therefore, is that democratization and even the consolidation of democracy has been so successful because it has been so much less consequential than its proponents wished and than its opponents feared. We were wrong in retrospect, and certainly this was behind all of what we were doing in that Woodrow Wilson project. We were wrong to presume that the previous supporters and beneficiaries of autocracy or authoritarian rule would strongly oppose democratization. They had learned rather quickly, and one hopes irreversibly, that democratization does not have to threaten their existence or their vital resources. I'd remind most of you that in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, with the exception of two governments, every single other government is now being ruled by a party which was formed from the cadre and organizational structures of the previous communist party. So that's a dramatic example of how fortune can change, but also how the so-called losers in regime change very quickly learn not merely to play the game, but that the game is not necessarily detrimental to their resources and even to their own selves, their own persons. In one of the few cases where the process of regime change did manifestly challenge and transform the resources of class and private actors, i.e. Portugal, these effects proved to be momentary, and that wonderful clause of the Portuguese Constitution of 1975, I love to cite this, no one believes it, but it was there, the second paragraph of the Portuguese Constitution in 1975 dedicated the government to the abolition of all differences between social classes. It got discreetly removed and is no longer taken seriously. Now, I don't have any time to comment on why this disenchantment has been the case. Just the observation that the strategy, if that's what it was, has begun belatedly to pay off. By foregoing, for one reason or another, the temptation to produce more than political democracy tutto e subito, right away, politicians have been able to agree amongst themselves that democracy has become the only game in town, as Juan Lintz likes to put it, even if they do not always agree on the precise rules for playing the game, and therefore are incapable of consolidating that particular form of democracy. They have tricked each other into playing according to contingent consent and bounded uncertainty, and they can now look forward to the perpetual struggle for who gets what, when, and how, and this may gradually and erratically fulfill some of those displaced, frustrated expectations that democratization has brought with itself. Now I'm going to say something about the literature on quality of democracy and make a few complaints and then say something about what I think might improve it. First one, preliminary and very minor criticism perhaps. We really should not talk about the quality of democracy. We should be talking about qualities of democracy. The presumption that all that is good and all that is bad with democracy somehow clusters together and therefore can be monitored, scored, or whatever it is by a single number or by a single adjective, and therefore we understand the quality of democracy as a sort of single continuum, is wrong. Democracy is composed of many different qualities, and I'll go into some of them in a minute, and therefore we should be very careful not to either assume that there is something like a quality or ranges of a quality of democracy on a single continuum, and above all, we should not be using aggregated indicators, among many of them, of course, that are used frequently, and I find them utterly meaningless, are the Freedom House scores, etc., which are even worse because they are aggregations of aggregations. So two countries could get exactly the same score and be completely, utterly different in terms of the detailed scorings on particular items or qualities that go into making those scores. Not to mention the rather obvious fact that by just simply adding together scores, sometimes you're assuming that everything is equally important as far as the quality of democracy, when I think anyone could tell you very quickly, and certainly citizens can tell you very quickly, that there are certain qualities of democracy which are a lot more important than others and therefore should be weighted in some way. What the weightings are is a matter of dispute, and you might have to weight them differently for different publics, but nonetheless, they certainly should not be weighted. Now, it's difficult to say, and in my comments now I'm not going to say qualities of democracy, it's just too awkward, but I just call your attention to that problem within the literature of over-aggregation and the underlying theoretical assumption, which I think is not sustainable. First complaint, more substantive, and that's the impression that neo-democracies are intrinsically and uniquely defective. All real existing democracies are defective, and each has its own specific deficiencies, both old democracies and new democracies. Real existing democracy, virtually by definition, is a compromise, a mixed regime with many non-democratic components and many heavily compromised democratic mechanisms, not the least of which is, we shall see, the mechanism of representation. They are all, in other words, works in progress that fail to live up to the potential embedded in democracy's core semantic notion of rule by the people. And if this were not confusing enough, the standards we apply to evaluate their performance keep changing. Yes, for many more countries, the only game in town has become democracy, but its goalposts are constantly moving further apart, and it has become increasingly difficult to award a high quality of democracy score, even from one's own citizens, since they will be looking across the pitch at other players playing the game and assessing their own quality, not by what's going on in their own country or what's going on there in relationship to what's going on in others. Now, the central theme, and this is something which I've been writing on much more than paying attention to new democracies, is that the old democracies of Western Europe have become increasingly defective in recent decades. I've just finished a green paper for the Council of Europe with a group of other scholars and politicians on the future of democracy in Europe, and its central message is the decline and the increasingly defective performance of democracies in Western Europe. And there's a good deal of data in there. We look at the last 30 years, and then we project forward for another 20 years, and we draw inferences about what it would look like. And then we have a wonderful part of this book where we suggest reforms as to how you could improve the quality of democracy in Europe. So the point here is the quality of democracy is diminishing, or real existing democracy is diminishing virtually everywhere. And the new democracies and the old democracies are not two separate clusters. They overlap with each other. And depending on your scoring system and your weighting system and what you think is important, it's not clear to me at all that neo-democracies are, even on the average, that much worse than you would expect or have come to expect in what I call archaeo-democracies. The second problem with the literature, I think I heard a bit of it this morning, is the trick of inserting an ever-expanding set of criteria into the assessment of the quality of democracy. The most obvious way to ensure that neo-democracies will be found defective is to extend the criteria for their evaluation in substance and or time to include dimensions that old democracies did not satisfy for many, many decades, in some cases for more than a century, and they have no conceptual relationship to political definitions of what democracy is. In other words, for those people who write about the quality of democracy, they should be reminded that they should specify not merely what democracy is in their terms, but what democracy is not, and what democracy is not necessarily capable of producing, or if it does, only over very long period of time. I remember one famous, who shall go unnamed, Argentine sociologist, who demagogically declared, how could his country be called democratic when there were children in it who were underfed? This despite the fact that the average per capita, or the per capita consumption of calories in Argentina is among the highest in the world. But I'm sure there are unfed children in Argentina. What this has to do with the quality of democracy in Argentina, I find disputable. Here are some of the examples. One of them by a very close friend of mine. Democracies are criticized for not respecting the rule of law for everyone and in every place, for not leading to increased economic development and prosperity, for not bringing about greater social equality and equity, for not reducing gender discrimination, for not eliminating poverty, for not improving ethno-religious tolerance, for not having a civic culture, for not respecting human rights, for not reducing criminality or internal violence, improvement in state capacity, for not having greater policy effectiveness, and you can go on down the line. Now, I don't deny that all of these are things which we would all like to see in these countries. Why it is we presume that these are to be produced and even become defining elements of the quality of democracy is what I'm challenging. There are many, many old democracies that don't fit well into this list. There are many, many periods, for example, where social equalities, growth, prosperity, etc., varied quite independently of the performance of democracy, because these are extremely complicated outcomes of a very wide range of social, economic, cultural, etc. exchanges. Now, nobody would deny that it would be nice if countries had all of these things. In fact, it would be even nicer if they had all of these things before they became democratic. I remember the discussion about that you could not have a democracy unless you had a civic culture. How you could possibly imagine getting a civic culture before you'd practice democracy, I never understood, but presumably it was a prerequisite for becoming democratic. No, I think we now know clearly that it's something that may or may not be produced by democracy, by the practice of democracy. I have to say that living in Italy, which does not have a civic culture, It has a cynical political culture, and it has been extremely important for the persistence of democracy in Italy. So I live in a country which I think is quite proud, despite a certain amount of defects, of sustaining democratic institutions, of a great deal of variety and vivacity, despite the fact that it has never managed to produce this magical Anglo-American civic culture. So even then, it still, in my view, deserves the title of real existing democracy. Third complaint, the reliance on absolute rather than relative measures for measuring the quality of democracy. I do not find it very enlightening or useful to be informed that the quality of democracy in Brazil is less than that of Sweden, or that the quality of democracy in Honduras is less than that of Hungary. What I think the concept should convey, if it is to be both analytically valid and politically useful, is the position of any specific country on these measures that we'll talk about in a minute relative to its potential. That is to say, not relative to its being able to mimic Sweden or, for that matter, even Hungary, but compared to its potential. The mechanisms of real existing democracy can be specified, I think, in a universalistic way. We'll see in a minute what they may be. So I reject the notion that there is or could ever be a distinctively Asian, African, or Latin American kind of democracy. We're looking for the same mechanisms, and the quality of those mechanisms, we'll see different configurations, of course, but the mechanisms of a real existing democracy are roughly the same. But what is not universalistic is the potential for reaching or sustaining a particular quality of democracy. How you perform or what you can do to improve that performance depends on where you start and what resources you have available at the time that you undertake this experiment in democratization. I was reminded of a famous, I think it's supposed to be Irish. There's an Irish priest is asked in the countryside, somebody comes up to him and says, "Father, how do you get to heaven?" And the Irish priest thinks for a minute and he says, "Son, there are many ways to heaven, but not from here." Some countries may have a more difficult time getting to the democratic heaven than others, and I think we should incorporate that into our understanding of the quality. Now, there are two problems with this business of relativism, let's say. One is that what determines the potential for democracy in a given country? There's a huge literature, as you know, on this, mainly focusing on levels of economic development. But what is it that produces this famous structured contingency, as Terry Carr likes to call it, that is embedded in society, economy, culture, and other things that, so to speak, form the denominator upon which, or that establishes the point of departure or the basis upon which we have a reason to expect different qualities of democracy. Now, I tried to do this just as a parenthesis in a piece I've been working on the impact of democracy promotion on and liberalization in the Middle East and North Africa, and democracy promotion in Central and Eastern Europe. And so I created a statistical formula to predict, as of 1985, what different countries in Central and Eastern Europe and different countries in the Middle East and North Africa, how well they would advance on a democratization score 12 years later. And I worked on a special system for scoring consolidation of democracy. 3 variables worked in both cases. The first, by far the most important, was the Human Development Index of the UN. That predicts most of the variance. Secondly was the openness of the economy at the time that democratization began. And third, the distance to Brussels. So with those 3 variables, looking at North Africa, looking at the Middle East, and looking at Central, I could predict about 3/4 of the variation of how well different. I could predict where Poland would be, the Czech Republic would be, Slovakia would be, etc. And as I say, I made a few mistakes, but 3/4 of the variation just with those three values. So that gives you some idea. I'm not saying there's a magic formula and that we can substitute distance to Washington, D.C. for the distance to Brussels in the case of Latin America, but nevertheless, I think you get the idea that there is a potentiality for at least using that and then evaluating relative to what we would expect given the context, the economic, geostrategic, etc. context, how well countries will do. Now, the second problem is much more serious. Namely, as I mentioned before, diffusion. For all I know, people in Honduras know what's going on in Hungary, and therefore they don't evaluate the quality of democracy in Honduras simply because of what's going on in Honduras. They somehow have learned that something's going on in Hungary which is somehow better, and certainly in a variety of ways, I'm sure that's the case. Not to mention, of course, that people, Brazilians may even imagine themselves as Swedes of the future. I mean, when I started out on Latin America, we used to think of Uruguay as the Switzerland of Latin America. Now, I don't know whether the Uruguayos will still compare themselves to the Suizos, but nonetheless. So that is a problem if you are not just evaluating the quality of democracy from an analytical perspective, but if you assume that it is going to be related to subjective perceptions about the quality of democracy in the countries you're studying. Because when it comes to the subjective perceptions, they may not be relative only to the conditions that obtain at the moment or during a transition. Countries, populations may in fact be fixed on others. I suggest 3 potential shortcuts for those who would like to get into this racket of quality of democracy. The first, of course, is to evaluate the quality of democracy essentially among groups of countries that are democratizing more or less within the same time frame. Because as I pointed out, questions of the standards of democracy and expectations about democracy have changed radically over time, and therefore displacing your standards, so to speak, across long points of time don't seem to me to be very valuable. So if we think of the last wave of democracy that succeeded the end of World War II, I think you cannot really compare the quality of democracy in those countries with the quality of democracies after 1970, because I think that the standards for evaluation have systematically changed in the meantime. The second is to compare the quality of democracies only across countries within the same cultural area or geopolitical region, assuming, therefore, that there are certain communalities at the point of departure. This was relatively easy for us to do when we began studying Central and Eastern Europe. The simple fact that these countries had all been under roughly the same kind of previous autocracy, that their ranges in economic development, sometimes even the degree of relative openness, etc., were within a fairly narrow range, and therefore we could compare them at point of departure as if they all had the same potential, except, of course, for those in the former republics of the Yugoslavia, which began to go to war with each other and obviously displaced and changed radically the entire equation. And then finally, consider that all countries that have been real existing democracies for 20 or more years, regardless of where they are, should be considered to have the same potential for quality of democracy in the future. So if you've been able to sustain democracy over a certain thing, then there's a high likelihood that the criteria of evaluation of performance then becomes more valid. For example, this morning, as Evelyn did in comparing the overtime performance of places like Costa Rica, or for that matter, Uruguay, on certain welfare measures with those in Europe, is perfectly valid because these countries have had, with a slight interruption in the case of Uruguay, long-term democratic regimes and have been practicing various kinds of policies of social welfare differently, no doubt. Now, if you think of this relativist term, it seems to me that it has another very interesting effect from a theoretical perspective, but also from a kind of practical policy perspective. Because if you shift to a realistic or a relativistic basis for evaluating quality of democracy, you will not assume that similar or identical institutions will produce similar or identical effects across these countries. So the usual panaceas that are being peddled, there are three, more or less, in the literature. One of them, of course, is somehow parliamentarism is supposed to be better than presidentialism, both for the consolidation of democracy, and some people even claim the quality of democracy. I see absolutely no reason to believe this. And I think the data is now catching up with us, and that was simply a delayed Latin American effect, in my view, because most of presidential systems historically have been numerically, so to speak, in Latin America. Secondly, the notion that two-party systems based on first-past-the-post electoral systems are somehow supposed to have higher quality of democracy because there's a greater possibility for the electorate to hold the elected officials accountable in those kinds of... I see no compelling evidence for this whatsoever, and I also have no reason to believe that those systems put in different context, points of departure, etc., will produce the same effects. And then finally, perhaps most controversially, especially in the light of the talk that was given this morning about India, this notion, very strongly promoted by many international financial institutions here in Washington, among others, that somehow the quality of democracy will be improved if one decentralizes and even federalizes the polity that is being democratized, so that somehow decentralization is regarded as desirable in itself, but also presumably, and sometimes even included in the actual indicator of the quality of democracy. I see no reason for this to be the case, but it's certainly the case, it has been the case in certain places. Other places it has not produced that same place, and just simply saying when you almost every Latin American country that has democratized since 1970, the early 80s, let's say, has at the same time decentralized in different ways, but it has been part of the formula, so to speak. Whether or not the ones that have decentralized the most have actually had better quality of the I don't see the evidence for this. And so there are certainly good effects and there are certainly negative effects from decentralization. Now, let me get into the matter and then I'll try to finish quickly. Let me begin with a generic definition of democracy, which I believe furnishes a good basis for then exploring the question of the quality of democracy. Modern political democracy is a regime or a system of government in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens, acting indirectly through the competition and cooperation of their representatives. That's a definition that Terry Carl and I have been using. Notice that it has three components. And those three components provide you with certain ideas about what the mechanisms are. Citizens, the central component, and then the most distinctive component, certainly, of democracy. Representatives, keeping in mind, of course, the fact that there can be various direct channels of action of citizens in certain types of democracy. So while all modern democracies are representative democracies, all REDs, real existing democracies, have representatives in them. They have different representative mechanisms depending on the type of democracy, but they also have a certain degree of direct citizen action, which I will mention later. And then finally, they have this business of the competition and cooperation of rulers. So competitiveness and collusion, to use the inverse, then, are the two kind of embedded rules that are supposed to surround rulers. And it's the interaction between citizens, representatives, and rulers that produces accountability. And that's the key property, and with the assumption that accountability is the distinctive property, outcome, if you wish, of a high-quality democracy. And in that case, high-quality accountability will bring legitimacy and responsiveness. So responsiveness then takes a different status. As you'll see in some of the arguments, responsiveness even comes earlier. For me, the core of these political mechanisms is to produce accountability and then assume that accountability produces long-run, not immediate, responsiveness and eventual democratic legitimacy. Now the problem becomes, what are these mechanisms? What is it that ties citizens, representatives, and rulers together in a game or whatever you want, in a process that produces accountability? What's distinctive? Representatives, of course, any kind of autocracy, all autocracies have some kind of representative mechanisms, and of course certainly they have rules and rulers. The distinctive, as I say, component is always citizens. Therefore, the basis of any evaluation has to begin with these conditions of citizens. Now, I can't possibly produce, just thinking about them, I've produced 33 different mechanisms behind citizens, representatives, and rulers. I can't go into them, but I'm going to try to give you some ideas, particularly about citizens and the role of citizen and citizen participation, because usually that's the key factor. We assume the existence of citizens, and what is crucial for understanding the quality of democracy is, so to speak, the different forms, degrees, meanings attached then to citizenship. Now let me give you an idea. I have invented a new scoring system, which I'm very proud of, but I haven't finished yet. But just for an idea, let's assume for a minute that political science is capable of, through comparative analysis, specifying what is, at any moment in time, the best practice in terms of citizen participation via legislative and presidential election. That's so key to everybody's definition. I'll start that because that's the core, if you wish. Suppose we could say, here are a series of criteria that we have observed in different countries, and this combination is the best practice. And therefore, how we will measure the quality of democracy is how close any given country comes to meeting these, quote, best practices. And even, of course, with the understanding that maybe best practice is impossible in Honduras or Brazil, and therefore the best practice, we must understand that they will fall far short of best practice. So let me give you a few ideas, just for the fun of it. This is in elections. How would I go about this? Now, this is completely tentative, and if we were ever to move in this direction, it would take a lot more collaborative effort, certainly with people who know much more about elections and electoral systems than I do. But let's start. For example, I would deduct 20 points. You start with 100. Everybody gets 100 to start with. 20 points if people only vote in national elections. 10 if you vote only in national and local, or national and provincial. So in other words, one thing that's important, it was mentioned in fact this morning, very, very, very central to this so-called second, second surge of democracy in India, is the existence of elections at multiple levels, and of elections at these levels which have some degree of independence of each other, which are not simply choreographed from above, say, on Soviet style or Yugoslav style or whatever it is. So the first thing is you get point deduction if you do not have multiple elections. You get a big point deduction, I suggest 40 points, if voting, de jure or de facto, excludes adult minority populations on ethnic, religious, gender, ideological, or other grounds. And then we come to the most sensitive point. Except for resident foreign citizens, denizens. So in Europe right now, one of the most serious discussions about the declining quality of democracy is the increasing proportion of legal resident citizens who do not have citizen rights inside European countries. So this is a particular, and this is of course going to get more and more serious into the future, right? And certainly so this country. Which leads me then to another point system. You get a loss of 1 point for each percentile of the age-eligible, legally resident population that is not registered to vote. Now, this is interesting because, for one thing, of course, most of those people are in Europe denizens, that is to say, legally resident citizens who are of foreign nationality. But also, in the United States, most European countries have permanent electoral registration. There's a very large number of people in the United States who never registered to vote, perhaps because they moved around, or perhaps they just never bothered to try it, or never been. In Europe, it's compulsory and automatic and permanent that you're registered to vote. So compared to an American democracy, then European countries would score relatively high, even though they would have this other. And then there is this interesting problem, which I was unaware of until recently, which is not the case in Europe, and that is in at least some American states, if you had been convicted of a felony, even though you had finished serving your sentence, you are still denied your civil rights. And since, quite frankly, that's not a random sample of the population, that is to say, there's a certain amount of racial, shall we say, skewed racial origins in this thing, that can look like a fairly systematic ethnic as well as policy. So that's not true in Europe. You're not allowed to vote while you're in jail, but when you finish your sentence, you are back automatically on the voting rolls as a complete citizen, for example. Now, those are small things, but if elections are close, etc., and this accumulates over time, then it makes a difference. You get, oh, this is one I love. This is hidden, not so hidden, but then we could discuss this. You get 1/2 point less for each percentile of the total votes cast that do not contribute to the election of any candidate. Now think about that. Now that's a discrimination against first past the post system, right? So in a first past the post system, if you win 51 to 49, the 49% don't elect a candidate, right? And even for a representative to now, in PR systems, as some of you know, there's a great deal of difference in how you handle remainders and things like that. But some PR systems, literally every vote contributes to the election of a candidate. Right? So, I remember there was an election in Poland when there were 56 parties running, and 53% of Poles voted for parties that did not get a single seat in parliament. So the Polish parliament, which is a strange place, and probably because of this, essentially was elected by 49% and had itself, I think, 17 or 18 parties, but had managed to make it over this threshold. You get 1 point, minus 1 point for each percentile decline in voting turnout compared to the moving average of 3 previous elections. In other words, in my calculation, again, relativistic, many people in the literature say the lower the turnout, the lower the quality of democracy. That's, in my view, not necessarily the case. That is to say, some countries have very different persistent habits of turnout, which go back into some of these other rules, I might add. My favorite case is the dear old Switzerland. Evelyn knows this well. Evelyn and I share a kind of Swiss connection here. In which it's the lowest voting turnout in Europe. The Swiss turnout at the 30, 35, and they sort of bounce along, but it never changes. So it's a couple of points here, a couple of points there, but But if you ask the Swiss about the quality of their political system, over 80% of Swiss will tell you they have the best political system in the world. So that's a paradox, right? So you've got low turnout. But for me, what indicates a decline in the quality of democracy is a decline in the average score. So it's whether you accept, so to speak, the intercept historical, and then what counts is whether or not you have a persistent decline or whether or not it's a change down, or for that matter up. You get up 1 point if it increases. And then obviously there are the usual things about whether or not there are accusations of fraud, etc. Now, if a polity being evaluated according to this tentative, I have to admit, scoring system on the quality of citizen participation in elections is evaluated with a score of 0 or less, it's not a democracy. If it has a score less than 70, it deserves some sort of adjectival condemnation. Whether you call it illiberal or semi or whatever you want to call it, I don't care. But now I don't have enough time to go on with these things. I think that I think you'll get the idea. The point is to try to identify, I have a list in here of 9, but it's, again, tentative. What are the key mechanisms that combine citizens, representatives, and rulers? Certainly, no one would deny that having competitive elections and citizen participation equally in those elections, counted free and fair, and all the other, is one of those. But there are lots of others having to do with civil society, having to do with direct participation, existence, increasing use, for example, in Europe, precisely because of the decline in the quality of democracy. There's been a very marked increase in Europe in the number of referendums and initiatives that have been held. So part of the failings of the normal system of legislative parliamentary representation are being shifted, so to speak, to an increasing number of direct citizen mechanisms of direct citizen consultation. So we identify a certain number of these. We should get together a number of people who could agree on what are these core mechanisms. I say I've thought of 33 of them. That's just too many. So we've got to think in terms of a core of these, decide what is the best practice at this particular moment in each one of these, and then how much, so to speak, of a deficit or of an adjectival condemnation one should do for these kind of what I think are rather subtle often things. Now, the end point of this is accountability. Now, some of you in this room will certainly know that there's been quite a bit of discussion about accountability and what it is. I'll just say a few words about it before finishing. Historically, in democratic theory, the central form of accountability is this vertical accountability. You have citizens, representatives, who, at least in a parliamentary system, it's a bit more complicated, obviously, in a presidential system, produce governments, form governments by forming alliances, etc. And that's the vertical dimension. There's been a great deal of discussion, led in very large part by my dear friend and colleague and co-author Guillermo O'Donnell, but many others, and many perhaps in this very room, because it's in my view, it's part of the Washington consensus about politics, not the Washington consensus about desirable economic policy, but it seems to be a Washington consensus that so-called horizontal accountability is a desirable quality of democracy, checks and balances, etc. I will admit that I'm not as enthusiastic about including it as but there's so much literature about it that we must have some kind of way of measuring how those horizontal mechanisms actually operate. As I mentioned earlier, the number of them and their insertion into the new constitutions, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, is quite phenomenal. So there's literally not a single Central and Eastern European country that does not have an independent Supreme Court, that does not have an ombudsman, that doesn't have a general accounting office, that doesn't have an independent electoral commission, blah, 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 all of this. Now, this reminds me of something else, which I probably should have said earlier. One of the fundamental differences in comparing quality of democracy in different parts of the world has to do with this, quote, distance from Brussels. Not that it's the distance from Brussels that counts. It's the distance from, or the likely, or the probabilities that the country will be able to join the European Union. That's the real variable, not just the physical distance from Brussels. And that has dramatically changed the quality of democracy in European countries. So many of the things I just mentioned are virtually imposed upon these countries by the various kinds of criteria, the so-called Copenhagen criteria invented by the European Union. Footnote, it's kind of interesting that these famous Copenhagen criteria, which incidentally got more and more detailed and more extensive as discussions went on, are criteria that the existing member states do not apply to themselves. So ironically, the new member states, at least on paper, are supposed to have higher quality institutions than the existing member states, simply because they came later and the clout or the power was there to enforce these kinds of new institutions of horizontal accountability. Finally, in addition to horizontal and vertical, I think you will find a very interesting literature. I call it oblique accountability, but it's also been called social accountability by Shmulevitz, I think her name is, Argentine, right? What's the first name? Catalina, yeah, and other Argentine. I mean, this is the accountability to civil society outside or alongside the party system. So the party system tends to be the one that structures the vertical accountability, in at least historically, in real existing democracy. What is very interesting is these mechanisms of oblique or social accountability in which institutions which have a somewhat ambiguous status. They are private and non-profit organizations usually, but if you look at them a bit closer, you will often find heavy subsidization either from foreign sources or from government and other sources. So they're not really purely private groups. I think of them as semi-public groups, trade unions, for example, professional associations, all sorts of NGOs and advocacy groups, who then have been playing an increasingly important role. And that role, incidentally, is not as constitutionalized as you will find in the case of the vertical and the horizontal. So you can capture much of the qualities of horizontal and vertical by looking at, so to speak, the formal rules and then trying to understand whether the formal rules are being used, whereas this oblique accountability is a much more informal, episodic, and I would say dynamic form which develops over time. Okay, to conclude. If you take this relativistic view, and if you admit from the beginning that real existing democracies that have been established for some time are not doing very well, are in fact declining in a number of key indicators, then it's not true that new democracies are doing that badly. Certainly not that badly given the point of departure. In fact, one could even argue they are doing astonishingly well from that perspective. Secondly, as Evelyn reminded us this morning, it may be too early to judge.